Okay, I think we're just about ready to get started here. Great, my slides are up there. All right, hey, thanks for making it over here to the far corner of the conference, especially after lunch. I appreciate that. So I'm here to talk to you today about a couple things that are near and dear to my heart. I work at Cisco. I'm in the DevNet team. I've been working at Cisco for a lot of years, and I think even before I started working at Cisco, I was involved doing a lot with standards. And then shortly before joining Cisco, I started to do some work with open source. And so I've seen a lot of value in both open source and in standards. And so here to talk to you about how I think by combining those two, bringing those two together and bringing those two different communities together, I think there's a lot of benefit there for both communities. Now, all of you are here at the OpenStack Summit. So obviously, I kind of assume that you are a fan of open source. Otherwise, there's a good chance you wouldn't be here. How many of you are familiar with standards and have done some work there? Okay, well, that's good too. And for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with standards or don't have as high opinion of standards as you do of open source, hopefully I'll at least give you some reason as to why you might want to look at them and some reasons why this combination of the two could be quite valuable. So to begin, why standards? Why am I talking about that? Why do I think they're important? Well, I think for a number of years, standards have really played a very critical role in many large industries. It's been, I would say, demanded of industry, the players there, when they're going to purchase something from you, they really require that you support standards. And their main reasons for that are that if you're like, say, a service provider, if you're someone putting together a service, something that's going to last for a long time, you don't want to be stuck with any one vendor. You want to be able to mix and match equipment from just best in breed. You want to be able to change who your suppliers are over time and not lose your investment. So it's really, really important to you that the people you deal with, the companies that provide you equipment, that they support standards, that their implementations are standards-based, so that you not only avoid that vendor lock-in, but you also get interoperability among equipment from multiple different vendors. So because of this, for the vendors, standards were very important as well. And it was important for vendors to come together and work with each other on standards. And you may think, well, why is that? Like maybe these vendors, you're competitive. Why would you, participate with your vendor on competitive activities? Well, it was really in the best interest of the vendors to do that because that enabled them to establish legitimacy for their products. It enabled them to sell into these markets. So it was really just in their best interest. And then they also get some benefit of if their product interoperates well with their partners, with even their competitors, that's going to make their life easier down the road when they're dealing with these, say, large installed bases that involve their equipment. If the interoperability is there, it makes everyone's life better. So it was in the best interest of the vendors as well to participate in these standards activities. So why open source then? If standards is kind of dominating the way that these industries were going, why is open source important? And I think especially in the last 5, maybe more years, standards have really started to play a much bigger role in large industries. And I think what you'll see now is that in a lot of industry, it's like the industry demands open source. Just like they demanded standards, they're now dictating that you need to have an open source story. And if you don't have an open source story, support for open source within your products, if you don't use open source, if you can't talk with them about that, you don't even really get a seat at the table in terms of providing them a solution because they value open source that much. Another reason I think that open source is important, and this one may not be as obvious, is I think open source can be used both offensively and defensively. And what I mean by defensively, if you think about the standards industry and how much time and effort people put into creating those standards, implementing them in their products and solutions, now you have a lot of investment, right, in these standards. And so if you can take those same standards and get them supported in the open source community and the open source projects, that really extends the life, the value of those standards that you spent so much time on. It gives them continued credibility. It allows you to interwork not only with the partners and competitors I talked about before, but now your solution all interoperates well with open source projects too, if they support those same standards. So it's a lot of value. It brings you to, defensively, your leadership position in standards can be enhanced by getting support for those same standards in open source. And then could also be used offensively. And what I mean by using open source offensively, you can think of a case where you don't really have a very dominant role in a certain industry, and you could go and spend your time investing, contributing to some open source project that would, and then make that available, right? It's open source, make it available for free, and you could kind of turn what was a very lucrative market for one of your competitors into sort of like a commodity type thing. You could really change the game there in terms of the economics and the way that industry plays. So, and then you could turn it from someplace where you had no product, someplace where you had no strength, into an area where you do have strength. So you can really change the game there with open source. So now jumping back to standards and the way that standards have worked historically, generally, you get people from vendors, from industry, customers, vendors together. They start to work on these standards. And for those of you who have participated in the standards, it can take a long time to produce a standard. So maybe over a few years, the standard gets produced. Now, after that's done, now you have the standard. Well, you still need to go off and implement that standard, right, and get support for it in your product. So that takes some more time. And now you come out with products from different vendors, and they support these same standards. But if any of you have dealt with this in the past, I mean, these standards are complex. And when you get two different implementations from different vendors together, chances are they aren't going to just work perfectly. So then you're going to have to spend some time on interoperability between these different implementations of the standard. So the problem is that just all takes time. And over time, it eventually works out, and you have interoperability, and life is good, but it takes a long time. And the fact that that takes a number of years is starting. It wasn't such a big deal a while ago, but it is starting to get to be a big deal. And one of the reasons for that is because of open source. When you look at what's happening with open source, you're seeing things like OpenStack, right? OpenStack really just, it came about, and it's really transformed the industry, right? When you look at cloud-based services, I mean, how many people were talking about that before OpenStack came about? And now that OpenStack's here, you're seeing private cloud, public cloud popping up all over the place, right? It's not that it's the only way to provide those solutions, but it certainly makes them much more prevalent, lowers the barrier to entry to get in and stand those types of things up. Open source allows you to leverage a vast community. Look at all the people who are just here at this one OpenStack conference, these people working, all of us working with OpenStack. It'd be very hard, I'd say probably impossible, for any single company to have this many people working on a proprietary solution. The innovation just comes at a very rapid pace, and in many cases, that rapid pace is much faster than the standards are really able to keep up. So in that case, you could actually see de facto standards, like code being a standard, where the standards community wasn't able to put anything together in time. Now, life isn't all great with open source, so I think there are some challenges, and we have to acknowledge that. There is, I'd say, some assembly required, right? How many of you are developers? How many of you who are developers, your favorite thing to do is to write code, write documentation on the code that you've done? Right? So, I mean, that's just human nature, I think. It's certainly developer nature. So with open source software, I'd say it's a problem with all software, but especially with open source software. The documentation may not be the greatest. If it exists, it may be outdated. People are always worried about writing new code, getting new features out there, getting things to work, and oftentimes the documentation is secondary. So if you're someone coming in and you're trying to put this together, it's not real easy to stand up your OpenStack cloud, right, and deploy it. It's not a simple thing to do. Projects sometimes fade away, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you have even within OpenStack, it's very easy to start up a new project, right? And sometimes it ends up being a great thing. Sometimes there's multiple different projects that are kind of in the same space, and maybe one of them wins out and the other one goes away. So, these things could move out from under your feet too. If you start to count on them and you're deploying them, that's just a risk that you're taking on. The other thing is, when I say fragments, even OpenStack, with as big of a project as it is, it's probably not going to be, if you have some use case, some need you're trying to fulfill, it's not like OpenStack's going to do everything. And I think you saw this in the keynotes on Monday. Integration's really an important thing, being able to combine different open source projects. And oftentimes, these various open source projects that you might want to combine, they weren't really built from the ground up to work together. So there's going to be some integration effort there that's non-trivial. So if I just look at a few examples of major open source projects here. With OpenStack being one we're all familiar with, I'm not going to run through the left-hand side. I think you guys all know what OpenStack is and what it does. But I think if you do look at OpenStack, and as I mentioned in the keynote, one of the big areas that we're talking about now is integration. And so even with something like OpenStack, and there is support in OpenStack for various networking standards. I mean, things like VXLAN, that's essentially an internet a networking standard that's used a lot outside of open source, and it's also then used within OpenStack for its networking capabilities. So that's great. Those types of things help, but still, there's a lot of work left if you want to be able to integrate OpenStack to work with other open source projects. Another example, if I look at Open Daylight, how many of you are familiar with Open Daylight? Okay. Not as many with Open Daylight, but it's a large open source project too for software-defined networking. It's a software-defined networking controller. And really what it provides is a platform on which you can write network-aware applications. Now, one of the interesting things, and one of the things I think has made Open Daylight pretty successful, is that there is support in it for various standards. NetConf, RESTConf, Yang, those are things that were all developed within standards groups, and they play a key role in how Open Daylight works and how it provides a platform for network programmability. So in this case, I think you're seeing some of the right thing happening, where standards are getting adopted and used within open source projects. That really makes it easier for industry to pick them up and start using them. OPNFV. So OPNFV is an interesting project. It's an open source project also within the Linux Foundation. And what it really is it's trying to tackle that some assembly required, that fragments problem that I talked about. What it is integration of multiple open source software components as an open source project itself. If you look at what the OPNFV community is doing, they're taking these various open source projects like OpenStack, Open Daylight, FDIO, making them all work to ONAP now too, making them work together. And the way they do that is they don't write a whole bunch of OPNFV specific code. It's really working upstreaming what's needed into the various projects like OpenStack so that it can work as part of this larger solution, which is to provide a carrier-grade platform for network function virtualization. A very complex problem. OpenStack provides a lot of important capabilities for that, but it doesn't provide everything, right? So you really need to pull in these other things as well. Okay, so by combining the open source projects with the standards, I think we really can get the best of both worlds here. You're probably familiar with the example of a tortoise and the hare. That's the way I kind of like to think of standards. I think it's pretty appropriate. The tortoise being the standards, of course, and you can see open source can run really fast and innovate quickly, but maybe take a strange or wrong path along the way. So I think here, by combining the two together, you can really get the best of both worlds. Something that's really important, if you take open source practices, the open source community, the speed and innovation that it has, and you bring that into the standards community, you can really advance the pace of standards. If at the same time that you're trying to come up with these standards, you're implementing the standards, you're writing open source reference implementations of them that test them out, you not only verify that the standard works well, but you also produce code that then people can use to implement the standard within their product, so that you don't have to wait for the standard and then add support in your product, right? These things can happen in parallel. Another thing is, if you use the open source projects, use something like OpenStack, and you use it within a reference implementation of the standards that are coming out, you make it much quicker for those implementations for solutions to come to bear. Now, how do you get this kind of combination of open source and standards to happen? There's various ways to do it. One is through coming to a talk like this and bringing those communities together. But a way that I've been working a lot in the past several years is by running these hackathons. And I'm going to describe to you a couple different standards organizations that I've worked with where we've done these hackathons, and describe to you a bit about how they work, because maybe you've heard of hackathons run in other times and other communities or whatever, and not all hackathons are the same. So I'm going to explain these a little bit. But the key thing is that these are not like real competitive events. They're more cultural events. They're more bringing communities together and trying to advance the state of things, as opposed to really competing and winning and that type of thing. It's more of a friendly competition. So I've mentioned IETF a few times. How many of you have ever gone to an IETF meeting or participated? Okay, we have just a couple of you. So just to give you a little background, you may not have ever been to an IETF meeting, but chances are you know a little bit about what it is. It stands for Internet Engineering Task Force, and been around for a little over 30 years. Really came into being with the idea of defining the protocols that were needed to create the internet, to make the internet work. And nowadays that we all know and love and use the internet every day, it's not so much a matter of getting it up and running, but a matter of making it work better, right? And so that's really where the IETF and all its protocols and standards play a role. If you look at the various networking protocols that have come out of IETF, you're probably quite familiar with them, right? TCP/IP, DNS, HTTP, TLS. These are the core things really that on which the internet and all networks run. And then I also mentioned a few others: Yang, NetConf, RESTConf. Those are key standards in network programmability that I mentioned in regard to Open Daylight. Those came out of IETF. And then if you're familiar with neutron networking, of course you know about things like GRE and VXLAN. Those all came out of IETF as well, right? So IETF standards play a very significant role in lots of open source projects, as well as in the internet itself. So the IETF, the way it works is most of the work actually happens online through mailing lists. The IETF has 3 meetings a year where everyone kind of tries to come together and meet face to face if at all possible. But an IETF conference is really much more of a working session, I would say. It's not so much something like this where you go and listen to talks. It's more, you would have read people's internet drafts, and then you're going there to essentially comment on their draft and have the ability to discuss the draft with other people who are interested in that same area. Now the quote I put up here, this came about back in the very early days. I'm not sure if it was back when the IETF first started, but within the first few years. And I think it tells you a lot about the IETF. We reject kings, presidents, and voting. There is no voting. There is no like this is the Cisco point of view, or this is the Juniper point of view. It's everyone who goes to IETF participates as an individual, and it's all about rough consensus and, interesting enough, running code. So from the very early days of the IETF, this idea of having running code, of having multiple implementations of anything that you wanted to standardize was key. And so in the early days of TCP/IP, when they were standardizing that, you had to have multiple implementations of it before it became an RFC. We'll see that in a way the IETF has kind of strayed from that a little bit. I think that's one of the problems and one of the things that we want to try to solve. So the challenges, and I've kind of alluded to some of these already, the standard process within the IETF is relatively slow. It's also an aging community, and I don't mean that getting older necessarily being a problem. It's more that maybe new ideas, new technology, it's not finding its way into the IETF as much because it's a lot of the same people participating there. Therefore, it's a little bit harder for new ideas to come into the IETF when that happens. I mentioned the rough consensus and running code. Well, I think from the early days until now, you've started to see the balance sort of shift, perhaps a bit too much focus on the rough consensus and not enough on the running code. So I think part of what I'm going to talk about is trying to reestablish that balance. And because of these things, and because of the rapid pace of innovation that we see with open source and with other things in the world these days, the standards process just sometimes can't keep up, and the IETF can't keep up. And so before agreement can come on a standard, there's actually code that gets produced that becomes a de facto standard in that same area. So one of the things that I've been involved with to try to solve this problem is introducing the idea of the IETF hackathons within the IETF. So back in March of 2015, Cisco DevNet, that's who I work with at Cisco, we brought the very first hackathon into the IETF. And I mentioned there's 3 IETF meetings a year, so we got funding basically to an agreement from the IETF to try it as an experiment. Let's do it at the 3 meetings, one per, for that first year. We'll fund it and run it, and we'll see how things go. With the goal being that we wanted to advance the pace of standards work, of standards development within the IETF. And another goal was really to attract new people into the IETF. Let's get more developers in the IETF. Let's get students out of school who are fantastic programmers, but maybe don't have as much experience, or they don't find the standards being that exciting. But if they could come in and contribute right away because they're good software developers, that's a good way to bring them in and have them really start contributing in a valuable way quickly. So the goals here, more running code. Let's shift the balance back toward running code and establish that balance between rough consensus and running code. Open source. Now, not everything that happens in the hackathon has to be open source, but it sure makes it a lot easier, right? If you're trying to validate that a protocol works, and if everyone can share and make the code better, you get a lot of that same, many eyes on the same code that you get with open source. That really helps a lot. Collaborating and learning is super important, and what I mean by this is the amount of code that gets written during the hackathon is actually pretty small compared to the amount of code that's going to get written outside of the hackathon, right? So really a key thing there is don't just bury yourself in getting your little bit of code working, but take the time to talk with the people around you. If we can bring people from the standards community and from different open source communities together and get them working with each other, that's super important, perhaps more important than the code that gets written over the course of the weekend. Of course, we want to have a good time. At the IETF, cookies are a huge thing. It was funny to see, like, when cookies come out here, they kind of hang around and I see them left over at the end. That doesn't happen at IETF meetings. Cookies come out and it's like, whoosh, they're gone. If you guys haven't been to an IETF meeting, it's kind of interesting to see. And then, of course, beer. Everyone loves beer, so we bring that in as part of the hackathon near the end of the day, the first day. Again, just because some of what we're trying to do is have fun and socialize and have people collaborate and network with each other. Of course, we're trying to produce some good code, but the key thing is really bringing communities together. The way it works is that we have what we call champions, and anyone who wants to can be a champion and champion a project. Within the IETF, there's all kinds of standards being done in different areas, so anyone who wants to come in and lead a project on some work they're doing can come in and do just that. And then what they do is they say, hey, here's are the standards or the drafts that I have. Here's what I propose that I want to try to accomplish at this hackathon. Here's how you can help me. Here's a pointer to the code, right? They put the information out there before the hackathon so that people who are interested can come and join them. And they're also responsible for sending out, not just on IETF lists, but if it's something that, say, would be applicable to OpenStack or some other open source community, sending emails out to there too, inviting people to come. And then when the hackathon actually starts, what they do is they show up and they help get people up to speed. Usually it doesn't take too long, but you want to get people up and running so that they can be productive on your project. And then they spend time, of course, being able to work on the project themselves. So the hackathon runs basically all day Saturday. We do shut down at night, unlike some hackathons which run 24 hours or 48 hours. There, the hackathon's happening before the IETF meeting, so we don't want to kill anyone. We want to let them get some sleep. But we work basically all day Saturday and most of the day Sunday. Then we have some presentations of, hey, this is what I was able to accomplish. And we have some judging, because we do want to have prizes and have some fun around that in the spirit of sort of friendly competition. So we go through, and what the judges really are judging on is how much did you advance the pace of standards? How much did you bring new people who weren't, say, IETF community members before, that you were able to bring them in and get them to help contribute to something? Those are things that we're really looking for. And also, did you produce some utilities that are going to help people use or implement or support these standards in their own products and solutions? And the goal of attracting new people, that's super important and part of what we want to do. So we do try to make it fun and use Twitter, which is something, or things like that, which is not something your standards community people would typically be too into. Now this, I think, is interesting because the rules exist in the standards community for how do you work on standards, and everyone there's if in the IETF we have something called the note well, and the note well describes what it means to contribute and what happens with the IPR that you bring up during the IETF meeting and whatnot. But there was nothing in there about what it means to contribute code. What we actually realized was, for the most part, you're not really contributing code to the IETF. What you're doing is you're working on whatever open source project you happen to be working on. So maybe you're adding support for some IETF standards into OpenStack. Well, in that case, you're not giving any code to IETF. IETF has no say over the rules of that code. Really, it's the rules of OpenStack, right? So you're contributing code to OpenStack, you just happen to be doing it at an IETF hackathon. So we had to put something in place, though, to make that clear that the rules of the code you're working on are really the rules of whatever the open source project happens to be that you're dealing with. Being able to share the code's very important, obviously. If you already have a home for your code, then you just go ahead and continue to use that. But if you don't, we do have an organization within GitHub where we could create a project to host your project so that you can collaborate on the code effectively. And one of the things that I think has been interesting is while we've been doing this hackathon, what we're starting to see is tools from software development come into the standards process. So I mentioned using GitHub to share code. What's actually happening now is people are using GitHub to share work on internet drafts. They're actually creating projects around repos around their internet drafts within GitHub, and using that to collaborate on the written drafts. Just because GitHub is an easy and convenient tool to do that. So I mentioned the first hackathon was back in March of 2015. At that very first one, we had maybe 40 participants. And what I'm showing here in the middle there is just the growing number of participants. So actually the IETF, in terms of the number of people coming to IETF meetings, has slowly been declining, partially because of more remote attendees, because it's just easier and easier these days to not travel and to attend remotely. But the majority of the people still come and participate physically in the room. But what we see with the hackathon is while the IETF number of attendees is slowly decreasing, the number of people attending the hackathon is rapidly increasing. And you just kind of see that trend going. For some reason, the summer meeting is always the biggest turnout, and that's you can see the last one we had was in Prague, and we had 2,000 people. Actually, after this, just this weekend is when the next IETF hackathon is. It'll be in Singapore. We'll probably have less than 200, but we'll have more than we had the previous fall, I guess, meeting. And these are just a few quotes that I think I picked from various people from past hackathons that show some important aspects of what we're doing. An excellent opportunity to connect. I think that's super important, bringing different communities of people together, or even people from different working groups within the IETF who might not have spoken to each other before or realized what each other was doing. This next one, this good time hacking as a first-time IETFer, that's exactly the type of thing that I love to see. Someone comes in and this is their very first IETF experience, and they really find it useful because they're able to start writing and contributing to code and using their skills right from day one. Should have been part of IETF since day one. I kind of agree with that. Maybe we would have never gotten to this unbalanced, where not enough emphasis on code. The one up on the top right was very interesting to me. This gentleman, he traveled from Oslo to we were in Seoul. And he came just for the hackathon. He didn't actually even attend the IETF meeting afterwards. He came just for the 2-day hackathon, which to me was really impressive and showed me, hey, we're onto something here when people find that to be something that's important enough for them to travel long distance. And then this other point here, the bottom one, excellent way for new ideas to be tested out and running code. That really hits on that whole idea of trying to advance the pace of the standards. And so I think, to me, that was a great example of what we're trying to achieve as well. So I've talked a lot about the IETF. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit more briefly about another standards organization where I've been involved. So Metro Ethernet Forum, now known as MEF, was founded back in 2001. The idea being that you had a lot of, it was mainly started by service providers, and kind of the traditional standards thing, they wanted to be able to buy equipment from multiple different vendors and be able to use that equipment to establish carrier Ethernet. And not just within their own network, but across multiple different service providers. So service providers wanted to make sure they could talk from one to another using equipment from many different vendors. And there was a certification program put in place in addition to the standards for how these things needed to work. And multi-year carrier interworking was really key. And that started back in 2001, and now thankfully MEF was very successful with that. I think these networks are in place and we all benefit from them. The problem though is basically they solved that problem. So now you have a standards organization with all these members. We solved our problem. What do we do? And so what they decided to do is, well, let's look at going up the stack. We basically did layer 2 level carrier grade services. Let's see if we can move up and do more on top of that. And so what they've done then is define this lifecycle service orchestration, sorry, and for next generation networks, with the idea being that as we're adding programmability into networks, what if we can actually turn up services across multiple service provider networks very quickly, programmatically, as opposed to being phone calls and maybe months to establish these things? What if we can do it programmatically, and what kind of benefits can we get out of that? And so they've defined this whole architecture with a whole bunch of APIs behind it. Well, the idea there is maybe we can bring the hackathon in there too, and let's start to implement this architecture. So it's not just an architecture and specifications. Let's actually get running code. Let's get a reference implementation where we bring in open source projects and have them play the roles in that architecture that they can play. So starting back in November of 2015, we ran the first hackathon at MEF, and now we've been running them roughly twice a year there. And really with the goal, this one's quite different from the IETF. This is a much more targeted thing. We're trying to take this architecture that's being defined and put it into running code. So what happened in MEF, and this happened in a very short time frame. I mentioned we did the first hackathon at the end of 2015. It's kind of transformed itself from, before it was just this part on the left-hand side, your typical, standards organization working around specs, certifications, whatnot. Well, this whole right-hand side, all this open initiatives work, as they call it, happened. We have all these open source projects, OpenLSO, OpenCS, and I kind of misspoke. They're not necessarily open source projects. They could be open source software. They could be commercial software too. The idea being that they're going to be reference implementations of various parts of the overall architecture. And working with open source communities is key there. Also working with other standards organizations is key. So you see this collaboration part in the middle. All of this came into play just within the last 2 years, and to a large part because of the hackathon and the sort of collaborative spirit that it's building out. In addition to that, MEF created something called MEFNet. So while these open source while these reference implementations of their architecture are being built out through the hackathon and through other things, this is an actual environment in which to host it. So we can have these instances up and running. We can use this environment while we're at a hackathon, but also completely outside of a hackathon. It's there so that you can have running instances of this code that's basically implementing this architecture, and continue to test it out and refine it and improve it over time. The other really cool thing is MEFNet runs on OpenStack, which I quite like. Okay, this is just some stuff showing about, hey, how great some of these hackathons were. I'm not going to waste your time with that, because I want to have some time to talk about the last bit here. And really, this is the call to action I'd like to leave to you, and hopefully you'll help me get the word out about this. Really to champion this combination of open source and standards. And I think there's a lot of benefit from both communities if we are able to do this, because then what we can do is we can make these standards, which sometimes take a long time otherwise to form, we can make them consumable by the community, by developers much more quickly, right? If instead of just being a spec that we're arguing about, now we have some running code that implements that spec that you can pick up and start using and make better. Do that in parallel with defining the spec. And also, I think, make the open source consumable by industry, right? If we can get support for key standards into OpenStack, into OPNFV, into Open Daylight, it's going to make it a lot easier to take those and piece them together and integrate them together to form solutions that are useful. So I think that's super key as well. And so if you found any of this interesting, if you want to find out more information about it or about what Cisco's doing in general, say around open source, what I spend my time on, there's a quick link there to where you can become a DevNet member. It's free. A lot of resources there. I'm responsible for putting together this thing in the middle, which is our Open Source Dev Center, We have information there. The third thing I have there is our microsite on OpenStack. That's where you can get information about everything we're doing with OpenStack. But at the Open Source Dev Center, you get pointers to that and to all the other projects we work on, like Open Daylight, FDIO, OPNFE. And so hopefully you find that interesting. I do have stickers in the front and in back. They're the same stickers, so if you like stickers and you want to grab some of those, that'd be great. Help yourself to whichever one is closer to you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those as best I can. Okay, thank you.